Welcome to Sustaining Your Team. In this podcast, I'm going to talk about the role of teams in shaping the culture of an organisation, how working as a team is different from working in a group and what this entails, the skills required, and how leaders can sustain the effectiveness of their team over time. Let's start by taking a look at some less conventional perspectives on organisations and teams. If we work for an organisation, we are part of a team or even several teams. Many of these are informal teams, and a few are formal management teams or project teams. Teams are the primary way in which people relate to one another with an organisation. We talk about our team, or my team, or the team, and more often than not, we end up talking about relationships within the team, or how the team works together. If we talk about our organisations, we're more than likely to talk about them as if they are things with personalities in their own right. We might say, for example, that our organisation shows great loyalty to its people, or that it highly values business performance and is ruthless when people don't deliver. On other occasions, we might talk about our organisations as if they were machines. We might say, for example, that our organisation needs to be restructured or re-engineered, or if we're in a leadership position, that we need to drive it to higher levels of performance. And yet our everyday experience of how things happen in organisations is radically different from this. We know that it's not as simple as pushing a button and our desired outcome predictably popping out the other end like a chocolate bar falling into the slot at the bottom of a vending machine. We expect business decisions to be made on the basis of rationality and logic, and yet experience them as being made as much on the basis of emotion, intuition, and what feels right. We've been educated to believe that organisations are one of the few places on earth where rational linear cause and effect actually works. A leads to B, which leads to C, which leads to D, and yet somehow it's never as simple as that. The problem is that our conception of organisations is a fantasy. They're not machines or things, but in fact complex systems of human interaction and relationships. People in organisations spend their day in a constant stream of communicative interaction with others. These conversations may be face-to-face, but nowadays they're more often conducted via email, or on the phone, via BlackBerry, or on social networking sites. In a very real sense, the organisation is the patterns of people's conversations, and the organisation changes as these patterns of conversations that people have with each other start to change. Such patterns include what people talk about and do not talk about in organisations, how they talk about what they talk about, and who is included in and excluded from these conversations, and so on. Because they're seen as the key performance unit within an organisation and are perceived, therefore, to have high levels of influence, management teams are particularly critical in shaping the patterns of these conversations. The quality of the interaction between members of management teams will in many ways determine the nature and quality of the conversations within the broader organisation. And inevitably, this will have an impact on the quality of longer-term decision-making. And yet many senior teams in organisations don't really work as a team at all, but as a collection of individuals who happen to meet once a month by virtue of being heads of departments or a business unit. But before we jump to the hasty conclusion that this is wholly a bad thing, let's get real about the kind of work that requires teams to work as a team rather than a collection of individuals. By working as a team, I mean that team members equally participate in the decision-making of the team, and that as a consequence, close attention is paid to developing a high level of trust and openness in relations between them. The reality is that most operational decisions don't require this kind of working together. For example, while the marketing and production directors of a company must work closely together to ensure that the production schedule is synchronized with sales forecasts, and the finance director needs to be involved to look at the cash flow implications of varying stock levels, they don't need to involve the whole team. And they do not need to develop high levels of trust and openness to work through these kinds of business issues. However, work that involves open-ended problems, to which there are multiple possible approaches and solutions, all of which are not guaranteed to bring about a successful resolution, is the kind of work that does require teams to operate as teams. In other words, problems or challenges which are essentially strategic in nature require the input of the whole team. The development of business strategy is an obvious example of such work, but it includes any work that's concerned with the future direction of the organisation. So having set out a somewhat less than conventional approach to teams and team development, let's look at what implications this has for how the team works together. The diagram illustrates that increasingly higher levels of uncertainty inherent in the task set before a team require an increasingly greater need for members of that team to share with each other. Where there is less uncertainty, and people are pretty much agreed about how this task is tackled, like in our marketing and production example earlier, there's also less need to share. In this case, the team really does operate as little more than a collection of individuals, what I have called a functional group. Only if something goes wrong, perhaps there's an industrial dispute and the production is halted, or there are supply chain problems or product quality issues, in other words, uncertainty floods back, will the members of the team need to share. The functional group mode of working as a team is appropriate for simple puzzles of a technical nature in everyday work, where every member of the group is relatively competent in their field and speaks from the authority of their specialism. This is an ideal way of working when work issues are independent of each other. As the tasks set before the group become increasingly complex and inherently less amenable to a known solution, so the group needs to share more. The cooperative group mode lends itself to working on complex puzzles which impinge on the work of several members of the team. In this mode, group members recognize the need to give and take, cooperation, negotiation, and passing of information on a need-to-know basis. Sharing is restricted to what is necessary, and each group member works from the security of their own professional base, whilst recognizing the professional bases of their colleagues. The team mode is relevant for genuine issues where no one knows what to do, uncertainty is rife, and full sharing between team members is the only way out. To work together effectively in this mode, team members need to adopt the attitude that the good of the whole outweighs any one team member's interests, including their own. They understand that they can carry an equal responsibility with their colleagues for the whole, and for this work they are not able to rely on their specialism, because their functional expertise is simply not relevant for the problem the whole team faces. The skills required in each of these different modes or ways of operating are of course quite different. Polite social skills are important to maintain the social lubrication of the functional group, but are not focused on the work itself. The work is largely accomplished by task processes, the way work is organized, distributed, ideas generated, decisions made, and so forth. The cooperative group needs to develop straightforward interpersonal awareness and skills such as empathy, cooperation, listening, inquiring, and negotiating. Now, when groups work in the team mode, they need to develop very high-level interpersonal skills. This is because how team members subjectively feel about the task and the relationships inside the team is actually part of the work. Hence, the skills are around developing high levels of trust with one another, sharing openly, disclosing how one feels, and paying profound attention to one another, and so forth. As the leader of a team, how can you develop your team to operate effectively in each of these different ways of working? Well, the first thing to do is to identify the nature of the tasks which your team needs to address as a group, and then to consider the appropriate ways or modes of working together and the skills that go with them. Secondly, take a close look at how effectively your team operates in each of the modes and decide whether there is a need to develop the team's capability. And finally, think about the extent to which the work your team has to do requires it to operate in what we might call real team mode. If you decide that your team should be spending 5% or more of its time working together like this, then it's worth doing 3 things. First, Ensure that when your team works as a team, it's acting in service to the health and endurance of the broader business, rather than pursuing a more narrow or perhaps partisan agenda. Second, develop a team climate in which team members are enabled to flourish and realize their own potential in the service of the team purpose. Third, ensure your team is consistently brilliant at doing all of this. This is what I call a sustainable team. The first step in creating a sustainable team involves clarifying the context or playing field within which it operates and the expectations the organization has of it. The key questions here are: for what outcomes are the team held responsible? What is the team's scope? What's its remit? What are the boundaries? And what is out of bounds in terms of its accountability? What's its role and purpose as far as the organization is concerned? Having assessed the playing field, it's possible to explore the collective purpose and identity of the team more closely. Why does this team exist? How does it create value? For what does it stand? What does it stand against? What legacy does it hope to leave? These are questions that the whole team needs to address together. The team vision, in terms of the shared future the members collectively want to create, flows naturally on from this. Next, the team needs to examine its sense-making and decision-making processes. How does the team collectively explore new data? How are interpretations of this data made? What kind of data tends to get filtered out? How does the team go about making decisions? And so forth. Again, this follows logically on to an exploration of the team culture, the norms and patterns of behaviour which determine how the team works together and how decisions get made. Our research into sustainable organisations shows that there are 7 key areas to consider when looking at the culture of the team. Engagement. In this team, are we interested in finding a way to connect the team's purpose with team members' individual sense of purpose? Or do we think that members should believe that their outlook and interests are identical to the team's? Decisions. Where's the emphasis placed in this team? On the achievement of short-term goals in which only the immediate consequences of decisions on the business are taken into account, or on a more measured approach? Voice. Is finding and developing one's voice accepted as part of making a valid contribution to the good governance of this team, or conformity with norms and the status quo? Risk. What's the team's attitude to risk? Is emphasis placed on consulting key stakeholders before significantly risky decisions are taken? Or is it more about unilateral decision-making or decision-making by a small clique? Leaders. Is the leader of this team expected to recognise their limitations and to be held accountable for the consequences of their actions? Or are they encouraged to think of themselves as not needing to comply with the rules that govern the rest of the team? Vision. When difficulties are encountered, does the culture of the team encourage members to see possibilities and envision a better future? Or is it about forensic analysis of what went wrong and who's to blame? Finally, responsibility. Does the team act out of a sense of responsibility for the collective success and endurance of the enterprise and all its stakeholders? Or is the team's impact on the broader organisation, society and the environment not seen as relevant to decision-making? We believe that addressing each of these aspects will ensure that the team serves the broader organisational goals around long-term value creation and business performance, as well as sustaining the psychological and physiological health of the members of the team.